The soft hum of the city could be heard through the open window as Deena sat quietly at her desk. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds, casting slanted rays across the room. It was the kind of morning that felt both peaceful and quietly heavy, like the weight of her own thoughts hung in the air, unsaid but deeply felt. She looked at her vision board, standing tall in the center of the room, its presence almost commanding, but not in an overwhelming way. It was calm, steady, like the quiet foundation of everything she had built. A collage of dreams, wishes, and future plans pinned together with purpose. Her fingers gently traced the edges of the pictures that decorated it. Photographs of places she had long dreamed of visiting, quotes that inspired courage, and images of business achievements that once seemed impossible. The tropical beaches were a reminder of the travel agency she had been working to establish from scratch. The photo of a full conference room was a silent testament to the workshops she had designed and delivered, workshops that had slowly begun to grow in popularity. The luxury brands that graced the edges of the board were now logos she had started working with, clients she had managed to connect with and impress, even in her humble beginnings. But there was one image that always stood out to her, one that carried the most emotional weight. It was a picture of a room filled with women, all sitting with eager faces, waiting for a chance to learn, to grow, to be better. And one of them, Sarah, stood out vividly in her memory. Deena could still hear Sarah's voice, clear and dismissive, mocking her vision board months ago at a networking event. It had been a moment that she hadn't expected, a moment that almost crushed her resolve. Sarah, the epitome of success in Deena's eyes, with her perfectly styled hair and impeccable wardrobe, had taken one look at the board and laughed. "It's cute, I guess," she had said with a sneer, her eyes flicking over the images of dreams Deena had carefully arranged. "But you do know this isn't real, right? People don't just make things happen because they stick pictures on a board." The words had hit Deena harder than she'd let on. At the time, she had smiled, brushed it off as if it didn't matter, but deep down it cut. That mocking laughter had echoed in her mind for days, then weeks. It had planted a seed of doubt, one that she had almost let grow. But now, standing in her own space, looking at the board once again, the seed was gone. The doubt was gone. The truth was Deena had made it happen. Every goal she had written down, every dream she had pasted onto the board, was slowly but surely becoming a reality. It wasn't overnight, it wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't without setbacks, but it was happening. The travel business was growing. The workshops were filling up. And Sarah? Sarah was now the one who paid to attend her workshop. Deena took a deep breath, looking at the vision board with a quiet sense of pride. She had walked a long road to get here, a road full of failures, self-doubt, and rejection, but she had stayed the course. There were moments when she thought it would never work, when the bills piled up and the clients didn't come, when the doubts of people around her almost felt louder than her own dreams. But with each step, each rejection, each failure, she had learned to trust in herself more than ever. She had learned that the real work wasn't just about the destination. It was about who you became along the way. Her mind wandered back to that day, the day Sarah had laughed. Deena had wanted to prove something then, something to Sarah, to the women in the room, to herself. But the real lesson had been in the quiet confidence that had started to form in her heart. It was no longer about proving others wrong. It was about proving herself right. About knowing that her vision board wasn't just some pipe dream. It was the map of her life, and she was following it, step by step. Deena was jolted out of her thoughts by the ringing of her phone. It was a reminder about an upcoming coaching session. She glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. Deena's first instinct was to ignore it. She didn't want to go back to that moment, that feeling of being belittled, even if it was in the past. But a deeper, calmer part of her said to answer. This wasn't about avoiding the past, this was about growth. She swiped the screen and put the phone to her ear. "Hello, Deena." Sarah's voice came through, tentative and almost apologetic. "Hi, it's Sarah. From the event a few months ago. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Deena leaned back in her chair, looking at her vision board once again, the emotion still raw but now manageable. "No, not at all. What's up?" Sarah's hesitation was evident. "Well, I've been thinking about that workshop you mentioned, the one you're running now for women who are serious about making changes in their lives." Deena's heart skipped a beat. The Sarah from the event, the one who had ridiculed her, was now inquiring about her workshop. Deena took a deep breath. She had expected this day to come, expected that at some point Sarah might reach out. But to hear it was surreal, like a moment suspended in time. "Yes, I've been running it. It's going well," Deena responded, keeping her voice steady. There was a pause on the other end. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now. I wanted to apologize for how I acted at the event. I didn't understand what you were doing back then, and I thought I was being funny. But honestly, I've been thinking about it and I realize I was wrong. I didn't take your dreams seriously and I should have. I would really like to attend your workshop. If you still have space, I'd love to join." Deena was silent for a moment. She had expected many things, but not this. Not Sarah acknowledging her mistake. The words took a moment to process, and as they sank in, Deena felt something shift inside her. It wasn't about revenge or victory over Sarah. It was about something much deeper, about how far she had come. This wasn't about Sarah anymore. It was about Deena, the woman who had learned to rise despite the laughter, despite the doubts, despite the odds. The woman who had kept going, kept believing, even when no one else did. "I'd love to have you," Deena finally said, her voice calm. "I'll send you the details. I'll be in touch with the schedule." The call ended with a polite exchange, but as Deena hung up the phone, she sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the conversation. Sarah had laughed at her vision board once, but now she would be the one standing in front of it, paying to enter Deena's workshop. Deena could have felt vindicated, but instead, she felt something else. Peace. This was her story, her journey, and it had never been about the approval of others. It was about the quiet strength that had always been inside her, waiting to be recognized. And now, with or without Sarah's approval, she had learned to trust in her own worth, her own vision. She picked up her phone once more, checking the emails and messages waiting for her. She smiled quietly, knowing that her vision board wasn't just a collection of dreams. It was a roadmap, and she was living it. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. The weeks that followed Sarah's unexpected phone call were filled with a quiet, steady momentum. Deena didn't wait for the validation she'd once craved from others. She didn't look for applause to prove her worth. Instead, she buried herself in her work, focusing on building her workshops and refining her business model. The truth was, she'd always known that success wasn't about having people stand behind her and cheer her on. It was about understanding her own worth and trusting in what she could create from within. This was something she'd learned the hard way. She'd spent years doubting herself, wondering if she was good enough to follow the path she dreamed of. It was only through relentless work and growth that she finally discovered her own strength. As she prepared for her next workshop, Deena thought back to the days before all of this, the days when she sat in her small apartment, trying to put together a vision for her future. She would sit at her kitchen table, flipping through magazines, cutting out pictures, and gluing them to her vision board, unsure if any of it would ever come to life. But as the days turned into weeks, and then into months, something shifted. She began to believe in the power of her own vision. Her dreams weren't just whimsical fantasies anymore. They were real, and that belief, once planted, had grown stronger with every passing day. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that networking event months ago, trembling at the thought of sharing her aspirations. Now, when she stood before a room full of women, she no longer saw herself as the person who had to prove something. She was the one who was capable of making things happen. The first few sessions of her workshop were intimate. There were no big sponsors, no flashy advertisements, just word of mouth and the strength of her own authenticity. But what she lacked in financial resources, she made up for in passion and dedication. The women who attended her workshop weren't there because of a paid ad or influencer recommendation. They were there because they believed in Deena, and they believed in the promise she had made. If you want to transform your life, start with your own power. It was an invitation not just to learn from her, but to tap into the latent strength they all had within themselves. One evening, as she wrapped up her workshop for the week, Deena received an email notification. It was a confirmation that Sarah had signed up for the next session. The first thought that ran through her mind was disbelief. Sarah? Really? Her initial reaction wasn't one of excitement. It was more of a quiet acknowledgement that the past was now coming full circle. Sarah had laughed at Deena's vision board, laughed at her dreams, and yet here she was, paying to enter the very space she had once mocked. Deena paused for a moment, trying to reconcile the past and present. At the next session, Deena arrived early, preparing for another group of women eager to learn. She had developed a rhythm now, a sense of flow in the way she presented her ideas. But when Sarah walked into the room, there was a brief flicker of hesitation. Sarah stood at the doorway, awkwardly shifting from one foot to the other, clearly not used to being in a room where she wasn't the expert. She had always been the one to command attention, to make people listen to her. Now in Deena's workshop, she was just another woman like the others. "Hi Deena," Sarah said, her voice soft but apologetic. Deena gave her a warm smile, one that felt genuine, not forced. "Hey Sarah, glad you could make it." As Sarah found her seat in the circle, Deena couldn't help but notice the way she looked around, slightly uncomfortable. It was clear she wasn't used to being in a setting where she wasn't the center of attention, where she had to listen and learn rather than talk and teach. Deena kept her focus, however. This wasn't the time for her to dwell on the past. It was about moving forward and creating a space where everyone, Sarah included, could learn, grow, and embrace their own strength. The session began, and Deena dove right into the material. She guided the group through exercises that encouraged self-reflection and goal-setting. She spoke about the importance of vision, not just in terms of material success, but in understanding who you are, what you value, and how to take ownership of your own life. As she spoke, she could feel a subtle shift in the room. There was a quiet energy, a sense of women awakening to their own power. After a while, Deena noticed Sarah was taking notes intently, her pen moving quickly across the page. Her posture had shifted from one of uncertainty to something more grounded, more engaged. When Deena opened the floor for discussion, Sarah spoke up. "You know, when I first met you," Sarah began, her voice a little shaky but full of honesty, "I didn't get it. I didn't understand what you were trying to do. But now, after sitting here for a while, I see it. I see what you're doing. And I'm really glad I'm here." Deena's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the apology that moved her. It was the transformation she saw in Sarah. For all of Sarah's past mockery, for all of the times she had belittled Deena's dreams, Sarah was now beginning to see the power of what Deena had created. It was a quiet victory, not just for Deena, but for Sarah as well. "I'm glad you're here too, Sarah," Deena said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "This space is for all of us to learn and grow. No one is above or below anyone else here. We're all on this journey together." The rest of the session went by smoothly. There was no more tension, no more awkwardness. Sarah was fully engaged, and Deena could sense that something had shifted inside her. For the first time, Deena felt the full weight of her transformation. It wasn't about the approval of others anymore. It was about the quiet but powerful shift she had undergone herself. She had gone from the woman who had been mocked for her dreams to the woman who was now creating a space for others to achieve their own. As the session came to a close, Deena watched her students file out of the room. They were eager, energized, and full of potential. She could see the spark in their eyes, the same spark that had ignited in her all those months ago when she first put together her vision board. It was a spark of belief that they too could create something amazing, something real. Deena stayed behind for a moment, tidying up the room, her mind racing with possibilities. She had come so far, but this was just the beginning. The woman who had once doubted herself now stood in front of a group of women who believed in her, who believed in the vision she had created. It was a reminder that everything she had built was real, and that the power to build more, to create more, was still within her. As she walked out of the room, she couldn't help but smile. The world had laughed at her dreams. Now it was paying attention. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. As the weeks passed, Deena began to see the fruits of her labor take shape. The quiet workshop she had started with a handful of women now buzzed with energy. Word of mouth had spread, and each new session brought more participants, more women eager to learn, grow, and transform their lives. The room was no longer just a physical space. It was a sanctuary where ambition met action. And yet, for all the success, there were still moments when Deena questioned whether it was all real. She had come a long way since the days of self-doubt, but the fear of failure was still present. It wasn't the all-consuming kind she had once felt, the kind that paralyzed her every time she thought about the future. No, this fear was quieter, more subtle. It crept up on her in moments of silence, in the stillness between the sessions, when she allowed herself to pause and reflect. She worried, what if this all crumbled? What if the dream she had built was just a temporary illusion? Deena shook her head, willing the thoughts away. She had worked too hard to let fear steal her progress. But even as she battled with these quiet doubts, she knew something had shifted within her. The woman who had walked into that first networking event, unsure of her own worth, was no longer the same. She had become a version of herself who could trust the process, who knew that growth came with both victories and setbacks. But every setback had been a lesson, and every lesson had brought her closer to the woman she was now. Her small team of workshop participants had become her community. They weren't just people attending a course, they were her supporters, her believers. They saw something in her that she hadn't always seen in herself. There was power in that. The validation she had once sought from others was no longer as important as the connection she had cultivated with the women around her. This connection wasn't based on admiration or praise. It was based on shared struggles and collective growth. Deena had built this space by listening. She had listened to their fears, their struggles, their dreams. She had created a place where they could feel safe enough to be vulnerable and brave enough to push past their limitations. And in turn, they had given her something she had never expected, a sense of belonging. It wasn't about being seen or admired, it was about being heard. And for Deena, that was more powerful than anything else. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Deena sat at her desk, reviewing the content for the next workshop. She had planned every session meticulously, knowing that each one had the potential to change lives. Yet, as she sat there, staring at her notes, a familiar anxiety crept in. Was this enough? She questioned. Am I really doing enough to help these women reach their full potential? She shook her head and let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. Her fear of inadequacy was a constant companion, but it was no longer her master. She had come to understand that perfection was not the goal. Progress was. And as long as she kept showing up, as long as she kept doing the work, she was moving forward. Deena stood up and walked to the back of the room, where a large whiteboard covered one wall. It had become a symbol of her journey, a place where she could visually map out her goals, her dreams, and her achievements. She stared at it now, her fingers tracing the words she had written months ago. They were goals she had set for herself at the very beginning. The things she wanted to achieve but hadn't known how to make possible. She had already crossed off most of the items. The travel business was growing, her workshops were successful, and she had finally learned to believe in herself. But there was one thing still left unchecked. Expand beyond the local community. The thought lingered in her mind as she stood there. She had done well for herself, but she couldn't ignore the growing desire to reach more people. She had bigger dreams now. She had always wanted to reach women beyond her small town, to create an impact on a larger scale. But the thought of expansion felt daunting. What if she wasn't ready? What if this success was as far as she could go? She shook her head again, unwilling to let fear control her anymore. She had taken so many risks to get to this point, and every single risk had paid off. This was no different. If anything, this was just another step in the journey. Over the next few weeks, Deena started working on a plan to expand her workshops. She reached out to a few mentors who had been in the business longer than her, asking for advice and guidance. She spent hours researching how to offer her workshops online, how to reach people beyond her community. Every small step was a step toward the bigger picture. And with each step, the vision of her future became clearer. She had once been paralyzed by the fear of failure, but now it felt like that fear was the fuel that pushed her forward. One evening, as she sat at her desk, drafting emails and preparing content, she received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah. I've been thinking about what you said in the last sess. Can't believe how much I've learned. Thank you for creating this space. You've changed my life. Deena read the message several times, each word settling in her chest like a gentle embrace. It was the kind of message that she had once longed for, proof that her work mattered. But now, she realized she didn't need this external validation to feel fulfilled. She had already seen the impact she was having on her community, and that was enough. As the days passed, Deena continued to build her business with the same quiet determination that had carried her this far. She worked late into the night, perfecting the details of her online workshops, writing blogs, creating videos, and reaching out to potential collaborators. Her confidence had grown, but so had her sense of responsibility. The women who attended her workshops weren't just students. They were part of something bigger. They were a part of the shift she was creating in the world, and that responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was easy to get caught up in the day-to-day tasks of running a business, the emails, the planning, the marketing, but every once in a while, Deena would stop and look at her vision board. She would trace her fingers over the images of the life she had dreamed of, and she would smile. Her journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And as she moved forward, she realized that she had already built the foundation for something incredible. She had created a space where dreams were no longer just fantasies, where women could step into their power, and where she could finally live out the life she had once only imagined. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in her life, Deena felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and that was enough. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. It was early morning again, and Deena was sitting at her desk, sipping on a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The room was still quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She had grown accustomed to these moments of solitude, to the silence that followed the early hours of the day. This was when she could think, when she could truly focus on the next step of her journey. But as she stared at the computer screen, the cursor blinking at her, she found herself drifting into thoughts she hadn't wanted to revisit. The weight of the past was starting to feel heavier again. Old memories, old doubts, old failures. It wasn't the kind of failure that came from external rejection. No, it was the kind that came from within, the kind that made her question her own worth. Deena took another sip of her coffee and exhaled deeply. It wasn't easy to admit, but she had been running from her past for a long time. The fear of rejection, of being laughed at, of being told she wasn't good enough, that was the root of it. It was the same fear that had almost stopped her from pursuing her dream in the first place. And yet, as she sat here now, looking at the life she had built, she knew it was time to let go of that fear. It was time to move forward. The past had shaped her, yes, but it didn't have to define her. Deena had spent so much of her life looking backward, trying to prove something to those who had doubted her. But what she had realized over the past few months was that the only person she needed to prove anything to was herself. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. A series of images flashed through her mind. Moments when she had felt small, unseen, like the world was too big for her to make an impact. She remembered the first time she had shared her vision with others, the moment Sarah had laughed at her vision board, the countless times she had doubted her own worth. All of it had been part of her journey, but it was no longer where she was headed. The problem wasn't just the people who doubted her. It was her own reluctance to believe in herself. She had let the opinions of others, the echoes of mockery, dictate how she saw herself for too long. But that was changing, and it had to. Deena opened her eyes and glanced at the vision board again. The images, the goals, the dreams, they were all still there, still real, still within reach. But now they weren't just goals. They were the results of her hard work, her growth. She wasn't the woman who had stood in front of that room, unsure of her voice. She was a woman who had found her strength, who had learned that her voice mattered. As she sat there lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. It was her assistant, Maria, who worked with Deena on the business side of things. Maria had been with her since the early days of the workshop, helping with everything from social media to client outreach. Maria had become more than an assistant. She had become a trusted friend, someone who believed in Deena even when Deena wasn't sure she believed in herself. "Hey, you're up early," Maria said as she entered the room. Her face lit up with her usual warmth. "I just wanted to check in on the new workshop schedule. We've had a lot of interest lately." Deena smiled, grateful for Maria's presence. "I've been meaning to look at it. There's so much going on right now. I just want to make sure everything's moving forward. Maria glanced at the computer screen and then at Deena, her eyes full of understanding. You're doing amazing, Deena. I mean it. The workshops are packed, the online courses are almost ready to launch, and the feedback we're getting from the women is incredible. You've built something real here. Deena's chest tightened at Maria's words. She had always valued Maria's honesty, but it was moments like these, when Maria reminded her of how far she'd come, that Deena realized just how much she had accomplished. For so long, she had lived with the fear of never being enough, but now she was enough. She had always been enough, and that realization was a quiet but powerful victory. I've been thinking, Maria continued, about the possibility of branching out more, you know? You've got a lot of women asking for one-on-one coaching. Maybe it's time to think about taking this to the next level. Deena looked at her assistant, the idea slowly starting to form in her mind. The workshops were already successful. The online courses were gaining traction. But could she take it further? Could she reach more people, expand her impact beyond the local community? The fear of failure still lingered, but Deena knew that this was a moment to embrace her potential, to embrace the growth that was waiting for her. I think you're right, Deena said, her voice steady but full of conviction. It's time. I've been running away from the idea of going bigger, but I'm ready. We'll make it happen. Over the next few days, Deena began to map out a plan for expanding her workshops. She started to focus on how she could offer more personalized coaching, how she could turn her passion into a scalable business model. It wasn't just about creating another product or service. It was about reaching the women who needed her the most, the women who had been overlooked or ignored. It was about creating a legacy that wasn't just for her, but for the women who would come after her. The more she worked on the plan, the more she realized that this was about letting go of the past, letting go of the fear of failure, letting go of the need for external validation. It was about trusting in her own abilities, trusting in the women who believed in her, and trusting in the process. The women who attended her workshops had become more than just students. They had become her partners in this journey. Together, they were creating something bigger than any of them had imagined. The decision to expand wasn't without its challenges. Deena had to navigate the logistics of online platforms, the intricacies of marketing, and the financial planning required to scale her business. But every challenge felt like an opportunity. It felt like she was finally taking control of her future, no longer bound by the limitations she had once placed on herself. One evening, as Deena sat at her desk, finalizing the details for the new course, she thought about how far she had come. She had once been afraid to dream, afraid to take the first step toward the life she wanted. But now, she was building that life, brick by brick, workshop by workshop, client by client. She had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to trust that the road ahead would lead her exactly where she needed to go. The fear, the doubts, the mockery, all of it was part of the journey. But now, they were just distant memories, echoes of a past that no longer had a hold on her. Deena wasn't just living her dream, she was defining it. And with each passing day, that dream became more real, more tangible, and more powerful than ever before. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. The first few weeks of the new expansion felt like a whirlwind. Deena had opened the doors to her online courses and one-on-one coaching, and the response was overwhelming. The women who had attended her workshops now had access to a broader community, a space where they could connect, share their stories, and learn from each other. The excitement was palpable, but with that excitement came new challenges. Challenges that, despite her best preparations, still felt intimidating at times. The technical side of the business was one thing. She had hired experts to help build the online platform, and while it wasn't perfect, it was functional. But the real challenge, the one that kept her up late at night, was managing the sheer volume of people who were now reaching out to her. The one-on-one coaching sessions that had initially seemed manageable were quickly filling up, and Deena found herself juggling emails, client inquiries, and scheduling conflicts. She had always been someone who prided herself on being organized, but this was different. The business had grown beyond what she had imagined, and now there were days when it felt like she couldn't keep up. In the quiet moments when she was alone, She felt a twinge of panic. What if she couldn't handle it all? What if she let down the very people who had put their trust in her? What if the success she had worked so hard for suddenly unraveled, piece by piece, because she wasn't prepared for this level of growth? Deena pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the women she was serving. She had built something beautiful, a space where they could not only learn but feel empowered. That was her true mission. The challenges, the late nights, the moments of self-doubt, they were just the cost of doing something real, something meaningful. She wasn't going to let the fear of failure hold her back now. Despite the overwhelming response, Deena made a conscious decision to slow down. She wanted to make sure that her growth wasn't just about numbers. It had to be about quality. She wanted each woman who joined her courses, each woman who took time out of her life to invest in herself, to feel truly seen and heard. Deena knew that to maintain the integrity of her mission, she had to make sure that every new project and every new venture aligned with her values. She spent hours over the next few weeks refining her approach, finding ways to create a deeper, more personalized experience for her clients. She hired additional coaches who shared her passion and commitment to helping others succeed, but she remained very hands-on with the process. She didn't want to lose the intimate, personal touch that had made her workshop so special. There was no room for shortcuts. Every woman who signed up deserved her full attention and dedication, even if that meant making difficult decisions about the future. One of those decisions came after a long conversation with Maria, her trusted assistant, about whether to take on more clients for the next session. Deena was hesitant. She wanted to say yes to every opportunity, to help as many women as possible, but she knew she couldn't stretch herself too thin. Maria, ever the voice of reason, had reminded her that growth should never come at the expense of the quality she had built. "Deena," Maria had said, "you've built something amazing, but this is a marathon, not a sprint. If you take on too much, you won't be able to give them the best of you. And that's what they need. They're coming to you for guidance, for support, for transformation. You can't be everywhere at once." It was a tough pill to swallow, but Deena knew Maria was right. She had been so focused on expansion that she hadn't taken enough time to reflect on the impact she wanted to have. The impact wasn't in the sheer number of women she could serve. It was in how deeply she could serve them. With that realization, Deena began to set boundaries. She limited the number of clients she could take on each month, ensuring that she would always have time to focus on the individuals who needed her most. She added new content to her courses, but also made sure that the pace wasn't overwhelming. She introduced a mentorship program that allowed her to work more closely with a select group of women, guiding them through personalized challenges and offering one-on-one feedback. As the business continued to grow, Deena found herself revisiting the core values that had driven her from the very beginning. She had started with a simple idea: to create a space where women could come together, share their struggles, and empower one another. That vision hadn't changed, but now she realized the space needed to evolve to meet the needs of a larger community. She had to maintain the heart of the work while adapting to new circumstances. One evening, after finishing another round of client calls, Deena sat on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes. It had been a long day, and her body ached from the constant movement of running a business. But there was a sense of peace that had settled inside her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was constantly chasing something. She wasn't chasing success anymore. She had already achieved that. What she was chasing now was fulfillment. The first time she had dreamed of building this business, it had been about the freedom to create, the freedom to help others, the freedom to build something that would have a lasting impact on women's lives. And in that moment, as she sat on her bed, she realized she had found all of that, and more. The growth had come with challenges, yes. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, when the weight of expectations seemed too much to bear. But the work was fulfilling. It was meaningful. And every time she saw a woman's face light up with the realization that she could change her life, that she could finally take control of her own story, it reminded Deena of why she started this journey in the first place. The next morning, Deena woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent so much time focused on how to grow the business, but now she understood that true success wasn't just about numbers. It was about the people she was serving and the lasting change they could create together. And so, as she started another day of coaching and content creation, she felt confident that she was on the right path. Her vision board, which had once been a symbol of distant dreams, now reflected a reality she had built with her own hands. It wasn't just a dream anymore, it was her life. And as she looked at it, she realized that the journey wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about the strength she had built along the way, the lessons she had learned, and the women whose lives had been changed because she chose to trust in herself. And for the first time in her life, Deena didn't worry about what came next. She was ready for whatever came her way, knowing that with each new challenge, she would continue to grow, evolve, and impact the world around her. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. The first thing Deena noticed when she woke up that morning was the stillness. It was different from the usual hurried pace of her day. No deadlines pressing in, no emails to respond to, no calls to make. For the first time in what felt like months, the silence didn't feel empty or daunting. It felt like a moment to breathe, to truly take in the reality she had created. Her life had changed so much in such a short amount of time. The business, the workshops, the courses, everything had grown at an unexpected pace. It was a good thing, something she had dreamed of, but it also came with a reality that Deena had to face. She couldn't do it all alone anymore. The workload, the clients, the logistics, everything was beginning to stretch her thin. The pressure was mounting, and with it came the anxiety that had always lingered, the kind that Deena had thought she had left behind. She stretched, rolled out of bed, and walked over to the window. The light from the morning sun poured through, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. She stood there for a few moments, simply taking it all in. There had been a time, not long ago, when she had feared this moment. She had feared the success that she had worked so hard for. It wasn't because she didn't want it. No, it was because she had never truly believed she deserved it. She had always feared that the moment she achieved her dreams, they would slip away, like sand through her fingers. But now, standing there, looking at the world outside, she knew something had shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had worked hard for this. She had built this. And she was capable of managing it, of handling whatever came her way. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory. After a quick breakfast, Deena got to work. She reviewed her client list, checked her schedule, and started mapping out the day's tasks. The moment she sat at her desk, however, the flood of thoughts hit her once again. What if I'm not enough? What if I can't keep up with this pace? What if I lose control over my own creation? The anxiety gnawed at her. There was so much she had to balance: client calls, workshop plans, content creation, managing the business side of things. Each responsibility felt like a weight on her shoulders, and Deena knew she couldn't carry it all alone. But she had been pushing herself to the limit, doing everything herself because she was afraid of trusting others, of losing control. After all, this was her vision, her dream. If she let go, what would happen? She ran a hand through her hair, taking a deep breath. The truth was, she couldn't keep doing everything herself. As much as she wanted to, as much as her inner perfectionist demanded it, she couldn't. She had to face the reality that the business had grown beyond her solo efforts. She had to ask for help, and more importantly, trust others with the vision she had created. It was a terrifying thought, but she knew it was the only way forward. Her first step in this new direction came when she called Maria, her assistant. Maria had been with her from the beginning, helping her with everything from scheduling to marketing. But even Maria had her limits, and Deena knew it was time to take the next step. Maria, Deena began when Maria picked up the phone. I've been thinking, we're going to need to expand the team. I can't keep doing this all on my own. We need more support, people who believe in this vision like we do, people who can help us carry this to the next level. Carrying, and I've seen the pressure it's putting on you. Let's find the right people to bring on board. You've got this, and now it's time to let others help you shine. Deena felt a wave of relief wash over her. For so long, she had held herself back from truly letting go, from truly trusting others to share in the journey. But this was a turning point. She didn't need to do it all. She needed to build a team, a community, a group of people who could help her expand her impact without burning out in the process. The process of hiring new people was a challenge in itself. Deena knew what she wanted: a team that shared her values, her passion, and her commitment to helping others. She didn't want just anyone. She wanted people who understood the heart of the work and who could bring their own expertise and strengths to the table. After weeks of interviews and vetting, Deena finally found the right people to add to her growing team. There was Alex, a marketing strategist with a deep understanding of social media; Emily, an operations manager who had worked with nonprofits and knew how to handle logistics; and Natalie, a business coach who had experience in helping people scale their own ventures. The moment she welcomed them into the team was the moment Deena knew she was stepping into a new reality. This wasn't just her business anymore. It was a community of like-minded individuals, all working toward the same goal. They weren't just working for her, they were working with her. Together, they would create something far bigger than Deena had ever imagined. The next few months were a blur of growth and change. Deena spent more time focusing on the vision, on where she wanted the business to go, how she wanted to impact even more lives. She wasn't bogged down by the day-to-day tasks anymore. Instead, she worked alongside her team, guiding them, brainstorming ideas, and creating new programs that could reach more women. The new team dynamic brought a sense of balance to Deena's life. No longer did she feel like she was drowning under the weight of responsibility. She had found the freedom she had been searching for all along. The freedom to delegate, to trust, and to focus on what mattered most: serving her community and continuing to grow. One of the most important lessons Deena had learned in the past few months was the power of collaboration. She had always prided herself on being independent, on doing things on her own. But as her team grew, she realized that she didn't have to do everything herself. The strength of the business wasn't just in her alone. It was in the collective effort of everyone who believed in the mission. Deena had built this business from the ground up, but now, she was leading a movement. And that movement wasn't about her anymore. It was about all of them, working together to create something truly life-changing. As the months passed, Deena's impact continued to grow. The workshops expanded, the courses flourished, and women from all over the world joined the community. But even with all the success, Deena stayed grounded. She never lost sight of the reason she started this journey: to help others find their strength, to empower women to take control of their lives and create the futures they deserved. Looking back at her vision board, Deena couldn't help but smile. The dreams she had once thought were impossible were now her reality. But as she stared at the images, she realized that the true beauty of it all wasn't in the destinations. It was in the journey that had taught her so much about herself, about resilience, and about the power of community. And as she continued to grow and evolve, Deena knew that the best was yet to come. This was only the beginning. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. Deena had always believed that success wasn't measured by how much you could achieve alone, but by how many people you could bring along with you. This belief had become the cornerstone of her growing business, her expanding workshops, and her newfound community. But now, as her team had grown and the impact of her work rippled outward, she found herself grappling with a new kind of challenge: staying true to her vision while embracing a new level of success. The new team was thriving. Alex was managing social media campaigns with precision, Emily had streamlined the operations, and Natalie was leading high-level coaching sessions. The business had evolved from a one-woman show into a well-oiled machine. Yet Deena still had moments when she felt a sense of imposter syndrome. The woman who had once doubted herself and barely spoke up in meetings now found herself in charge of a business that was scaling faster than she had anticipated. It was exhilarating but also terrifying. One afternoon, as Deena sat in her office, reviewing the metrics for the latest workshop series, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sarah, who had attended several of Deena's sessions and had become one of her most dedicated clients. "Deena," the message read, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I've been implementing the strategies you taught us, and I can't even begin to explain the changes I'm seeing in my life. I just got promoted at work. I feel more confident, more in control than I ever have. You've truly changed my life." Deena read the message twice, her heart swelling with pride. She had come so far from the woman who had once been laughed at by Sarah for her dreams. Now Sarah was not just a client. She was a success story. And that success, Deena knew, was a reflection of the work they had both done together. The feeling was bittersweet, though. As much as Deena had grown in confidence, there were still moments of vulnerability, moments when she wondered if she was truly ready for the next phase. The success of her workshops and coaching programs was undeniable, but Deena had always been a perfectionist. She didn't want to let the people who believed in her down. And now, with more eyes on her and her business, the pressure had multiplied. That evening, she took a walk around her neighborhood, trying to clear her mind. The cool breeze brushed against her skin as the sun dipped below the horizon. She had spent so many years working toward this moment, and now that it was here, she felt as if she were standing at the edge of something monumental. The future was wide open, but it felt daunting in its vastness. As she walked, her phone buzzed again, this time with an email. It was an invitation to speak at a national women's conference. Deena stared at the message, stunned. She had dreamed of this, of being recognized as an expert in her field, of being able to share her story with a broader audience. But now that it was happening, she felt a wave of panic. Am I really ready for this? She knew this was a moment she couldn't shy away from, but the thought of standing in front of hundreds of women, sharing her journey, made her heart race. For so long, Deena had been the quiet observer, the one behind the scenes, building her business and working with small groups. Now she was being asked to take center stage to speak about her life, her mission, and the work she had done. She knew this was the opportunity of a lifetime, but the fear of failure lingered. Deena stood still for a moment, taking in a deep breath. The truth was, she had been preparing for this moment all along. Every failure, every victory, every late night spent working had led her to this point. She had already built something remarkable, and now it was time to share that with the world. As she returned to her apartment, Deena sat down at her desk, her mind swirling with ideas. She needed to prepare for the conference, but more than that, she needed to prepare herself. This was not just a business opportunity. It was a chance to reflect on everything she had accomplished. It was a chance to step fully into the woman she had become, the woman who had learned to believe in herself and her ability to impact the world. She spent the next few days working on her speech, carefully crafting the story of her journey. She knew she had to be authentic, to show the struggles, the failures, and the quiet moments of growth that had shaped her. This wasn't just about showcasing her success. It was about showing other women that they, too, could rise from the same struggles. The night before the conference, Deena sat in front of her computer, reviewing her notes one last time. The speech was ready. The logistics had been confirmed. She was prepared. But even as she read through her words, the anxiety started to creep back in. What if they don't connect with my story? What if I fail in front of so many people? She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the one lesson she had learned time and time again. Failure is part of success. The next day, Deena stood backstage, waiting for her turn to speak. She could hear the audience laughing and clapping, the buzz of excitement filling the air. Her palms were sweaty, and her heart was pounding in her chest. But as she stepped onto the stage, something within her shifted. As soon as she began speaking, the nerves faded. She spoke from her heart, sharing the story of how she had gone from a woman who was afraid to dream to a woman who had created something powerful. She spoke about the struggles she had faced, the people who had doubted her, and the fear she had fought through to get to where she was now. The audience was captivated. Deena could see the way their faces lit up, the way they nodded along, feeling connected to her story. For the first time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like she belonged. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. When the speech ended, the room erupted in applause. Deena stood there, overwhelmed with emotion. The recognition, the praise, it didn't matter as much as the realization that she had done it. She had taken the leap, shared her story, and inspired others to believe in themselves. As she left the stage, Sarah, who had attended the conference, was waiting for her backstage. She walked up to Deena, her eyes shining with admiration. "You did it, Deena," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've changed so many lives. I'm proud of you." Deena smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Sarah. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us." And for the first time, Deena truly felt it. This journey wasn't just hers. It was a collective effort. one that spanned beyond her and reached the women who had supported her, believed in her, and walked with her every step of the way. As she left the conference that day, Deena knew she had reached a new chapter in her journey. The fear, the doubts, the struggles, they were all part of the story. But now, she was standing at the top of a mountain, looking out at the possibilities that lay before her. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to move forward. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. Deena sat at her desk in the quiet of her apartment, a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes drifting over the paperwork and the glowing screen in front of her. It had been a week since her speech at the conference, and as much as she wanted to bask in the success of the moment, she knew she had to keep moving forward. The momentum she had gained was too valuable to squander. She had worked too hard, built too much, and now more than ever, she could feel the weight of the responsibility she had to her clients, her team, and herself. But despite all her success, Deena couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. The past few months had been a whirlwind of growth, and while she had embraced it with open arms, the constant pressure to perform was beginning to take its toll. For the first time in a long while, she wondered if she had taken on too much. The anxiety she had pushed aside during the course of her expansion had crept back in, uninvited, whispering doubts that she had hoped she'd left behind. She took a deep breath and placed the cup on the table in front of her. It was time to pause, time to reassess. Deena had always been one to push forward relentlessly, but she realized now that she needed to recalibrate, to ensure that her success wasn't built on the precarious foundation of constant hustle. Success wasn't just about more workshops, more clients, or more recognition. It was about sustainability. It was about maintaining the quality of the work she had poured her heart into, without losing the core of what made it special. Deena leaned back in her chair and thought about how far she had come. She had started with nothing more than a vision board, a handful of dreams, and a deep belief in the power of transformation. She had been laughed at, underestimated, and doubted. And now she stood as a leader, a role model to hundreds of women whose lives she had touched. She had proven to herself, and to the world, that anything was possible if you had the courage to pursue it. But the question she now faced was how to continue that journey without burning out. She had reached a critical juncture where her business was no longer a side project, something she could balance with her personal life. It was her life, and she needed to adjust her approach to ensure she could sustain the growth while staying grounded in her original mission. The first step was clear. She needed to build more structure into her day. She had always been a night owl, working late into the evening, fitting in client calls, content creation, and emails whenever she could. But now that schedule felt unsustainable. She needed balance. She needed space for herself, for reflection, and for the creative process that had originally driven her. The next morning, after a restful night's sleep, Deena sat down and began to rework her schedule. She implemented more time for personal reflection, including daily meditation and journaling. She made time for physical activity, something she had neglected for months as the business demands had piled up. And most importantly, she set boundaries with her clients and team. While she wanted to serve everyone, she knew that she couldn't continue giving from an empty cup. She needed to prioritize her well-being. As she worked through the changes, Deena felt a sense of peace beginning to return. She realized that she had been so focused on growth that she had forgotten to take a step back and enjoy the journey. Success wasn't just about numbers or accolades. It was about enjoying the process, savoring the small victories, and giving herself credit for how far she had come. The following weeks were an exercise in balance. Deena hired a business consultant, someone she trusted to guide her through this transition. The consultant helped her create a more structured business plan, one that allowed for growth but also kept her grounded in her values. They worked together to develop a sustainable model for the workshops, ensuring that the quality of the content remained high while expanding her reach. But it wasn't just about the business. Deena had also realized that she needed to reconnect with the reasons why she started this journey in the first place. She had been so focused on building something external that she had forgotten to nurture the internal motivations that had driven her. She started to set aside time to connect with her community more deeply, to check in with the women who had attended her workshops, and to truly understand their needs. It wasn't about selling them a product or a course. It was about making sure she was still providing the value she had promised them from the start. One afternoon, Deena received a message from an attendee of her workshop, someone who had been with her since the early days. The message was long, filled with gratitude and appreciation. The woman had written about how much her life had changed since she first signed up, how the tools and strategies Deena had shared had helped her not only succeed in her business, but also improve her relationships and personal life. Reading the message, Deena realized just how far she had come. She had been so focused on the big picture, on the growth and the expansion, that she had lost sight of the individual moments of transformation that had made her work so meaningful. It wasn't about the success or the accolades. It was about the impact she was having on people's lives. She sat back in her chair, a sense of peace settling in. She had reached a place where she could see the bigger picture, where she could fully embrace the growth without losing sight of what mattered most. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Success was never a destination. It was a continuous journey, one that required constant reflection, realignment, and most importantly, self-care. The next step in her journey was clear. Deena would continue to grow, but she would do so on her terms. She wouldn't sacrifice her values, her health, or her happiness for the sake of success. She would embrace the opportunities that came her way, but only if they aligned with her core mission. As the months went by, Deena continued to build her business in a sustainable way. She grew her online presence, expanded her course offerings, and built an even stronger community. But she also took time to rest, to enjoy the fruits of her labor, and to remember why she had started this journey in the first place. The workshops, the clients, the success, it was all secondary to the work she had done on herself. One evening, as she stood in front of her vision board once again, Deena couldn't help but smile. The images she had once glued onto the board were no longer just dreams. They were her reality. She had built this life, and she had done it by staying true to herself. Her success was the result of years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination, but it was also the result of her willingness to trust the process and embrace the unknown. Deena had finally reached a place where she was ready to let go of the fear that had once held her back. She was no longer afraid of success, and she was no longer afraid of failure. She was simply living, working, and growing. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. Deena stood in front of her office window, watching the early morning light filter through the trees outside. The city was just beginning to stir, and in that quiet moment, she felt a deep sense of peace. It was as though the world was moving around her, but she was grounded, centered, in a way that felt entirely new. Her life had changed so much over the past few years, and yet as she stood there, she realized how much had stayed the same. The business was thriving, bigger than she had ever dreamed. She had expanded her workshops, built a powerful online community, and helped hundreds of women transform their lives. But even with all that success, there was still something she had to confront. Something that had been quietly lurking in the back of her mind. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself to others. The doubters, the naysayers, the ones who had laughed at her dreams. She had built her entire business on proving them wrong. She had done it for validation, for the sense of accomplishment, for the satisfaction of showing everyone that she could succeed. But now Deena knew that wasn't enough. She had to prove something to herself, not anyone else. Into her power. But as she reflected on how far she had come, she realized that the journey she had been on wasn't just about building a business. It was about rebuilding herself. It was about learning to believe in herself when no one else did. And now that she was standing at the pinnacle of her success, Deena finally understood that this was her real victory. The decision to move beyond validation from others had been a long time coming. She had spent so many years looking for external approval, from mentors, clients, even friends. But the deeper truth had slowly revealed itself to her. The real approval she needed was from within. She had to give herself permission to rest, to enjoy her success, and to stop feeling guilty about her accomplishments. But there was one more challenge, one that Deena had quietly put off dealing with. She had never taken a real break, not in the way she needed. The pressure of her success had pushed her to keep moving forward, to keep building. Every time she thought about taking time off, the thought of letting go of control made her feel uneasy. What if the business faltered without her? What if her clients were disappointed? What if she wasn't doing enough? But these thoughts were just echoes of her old self. The self who had feared failure more than anything. It wasn't just the business she had to learn to let go of. It was herself. She had to learn to trust that everything she had built could run without her constantly hovering over it. Deena looked down at her calendar, her finger hovering over the upcoming dates. She had a trip planned, her first real vacation in years. It wasn't just a trip. It was a time for her to disconnect, to reconnect with herself and the world beyond her work. It felt like an impossible decision to make, but it was also the most necessary one. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, she was giving herself permission to truly step back, to trust that everything would be okay. This wasn't just about resting, it was about reclaiming her life. The work was important, yes, but so was living. So was being present in the world, not just in the office. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Deena meticulously planned everything, ensuring that her team had the tools they needed to keep things running while she was away. She felt a mix of emotions, excitement, nervousness, and even a bit of guilt. But as she packed her bags and arranged for her final meetings, she realized that the anxiety she had been feeling was just her old habits trying to keep her in place. She was moving forward, and it felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. When the day came to leave, Deena stood at the airport, looking at her ticket with a sense of disbelief. She was actually doing it. She was going to take a break, to step away from the work that had consumed so much of her time and energy. The moment was monumental, not because it was just a vacation, but because it symbolized something deeper. It symbolized her commitment to herself, to her own well-being, and to the realization that success wasn't just about what she could give to others. It was about what she could give to herself. The trip was everything Deena had hoped for. It was a chance to slow down, to reconnect with the things she loved outside of work. She spent her days exploring new places, trying new foods, and allowing herself to relax in ways she had never done before. For the first time in years, she didn't have a schedule to follow or a client to meet. There was no to-do list, no meetings. Just her and the world around her. As she walked along the beach one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Deena felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The quiet whispers of the ocean seemed to wash away the last remnants of her old fears, her old anxieties. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to constantly prove herself. What mattered was that she was living fully and completely. She was exactly where she needed to be. On her return, Deena felt different. Refreshed, yes, but also more centered. She had learned that her success wasn't defined by how much she could do, but by how much she could give herself the space to breathe, to grow, and to enjoy the journey. The time off had given her a new perspective. She didn't have to keep pushing herself to the brink. She could take care of herself and still succeed. She didn't have to be a slave to the hustle. It was time to embrace a new rhythm. A rhythm that allowed for growth, success, and rest in equal measure. Deena returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew now that her vision wasn't just about building a business. It was about creating a life. A life where she could be both a successful entrepreneur and a fulfilled human being. It was a balance she had never truly understood before, but now, she felt ready to embrace it. Her workshops continued to flourish, but now, there was less pressure. She no longer felt the need to control every detail. She trusted her team, she trusted the process, and most importantly, she trusted herself. Success wasn't just about growing her business, it was about growing as a person, learning to live in harmony with the life she had created. And as she looked at her vision board once again, Deena realized that the biggest dream she had was already coming true. It wasn't the big milestones that mattered. It was the small, everyday moments of peace, joy, and fulfillment that had made it all worth it. She was living her dream, not just in the success of her business, but in the way she had learned to embrace all of it. The work, the rest, the journey. And for the first time, she knew that this was just the beginning. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. It was a rainy afternoon when Deena finally stood before her vision board once again, feeling the weight of everything she had built and how far she had come. The room felt quieter than usual, almost sacred in its stillness, as if the world outside had been muted, and only the gentle patter of the rain against the window could be heard. She leaned in, tracing her finger over the images that once seemed so distant. The beaches, the successful workshops, the luxury brands, and the faces of women she had helped transform. The road to this moment had not been easy. She had faced countless setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. There had been times when she almost gave up, when the weight of running a growing business felt too much to bear. There had been nights when she questioned if her vision was even worth pursuing, when the fear of failure loomed large and felt inescapable. But now, as she stood there, looking at the images of her dreams becoming reality, she realized something profound. It had all been worth it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty had brought her to this place, to this moment of true fulfillment. Deena had spent so much of her life trying to prove something to others. She had built her business not only for success, but to prove to those who had doubted her, who had laughed at her dreams, that she was worthy of success. But somewhere along the way, she had realized that the real victory wasn't in proving anyone wrong. It was in proving to herself that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. It was in showing herself that she could rise, that she could stand tall in her own strength, regardless of the opinions of others. As she stood there in her office, her fingers lightly touching the photos on her board, Deena thought about the woman she had been before all of this. The woman who lacked confidence, who was afraid to speak up, who felt like an outsider in her own life. That woman seemed so far removed from the person she had become. The woman standing here today was confident, centered, and unapologetically herself. She was a leader, a mentor, a woman who had found her voice and used it to empower others. And most importantly, she had learned to trust herself, to believe in her worth without needing validation from anyone else. There had been a time when she would have been afraid to admit how far she had come, fearing that to acknowledge her success would be seen as arrogance or pride. But now, Deena understood that acknowledging her success wasn't about ego. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the lessons learned, and for the women who had supported her along the way. She had built something meaningful, something that was changing lives, and that was worth celebrating. Her phone buzzed with a message, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a text from Maria, her operations manager, who had been with her every step of the way since the early days. Maria had been more than just a colleague. She had become a friend, a confidant, and a constant source of support. "Hey Deena," the message read. "I was just going through the numbers for the upcoming sessions, and I wanted to let you know that we're officially booked for the next 6 months. I've never seen the demand this high before. This is it, your big breakthrough." Deena's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, letting the gravity of the words sink in. 6 months. Her workshops had been a success, yes, but this was something else entirely. The demand was overwhelming, and it was a sign that everything she had worked for was paying off in ways she hadn't expected. But even as the excitement built within her, Deena felt a shift inside. She wasn't afraid of this new success. No, she had come to terms with her growth. This wasn't a fluke. This was a culmination of her hard work, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in herself. And yet, for the first time, she felt the need to take a step back, to breathe in the enormity of what had been accomplished. She remembered the conversation with Maria just a few months ago, when she had confessed her fears of losing control, of not being able to handle the growth of the business. But now, with the demand for her workshops reaching new heights, Deena understood that her fears had been misplaced. She wasn't losing control. She was gaining mastery over her own path. She had built a business that was scalable, sustainable, and meaningful. And most importantly, she had built it on her own terms. As the months passed and Deena navigated this new wave of success, she realized that her journey wasn't about reaching the finish line. It was about embracing the evolution. She had learned to let go of her old fears, her old doubts, and her need for external validation. She had built something real, something that mattered. And now she was ready to see where the next chapter would take her. Deena had reached the point where her business was no longer just about her. It was about the community she had created. It was about the women whose lives had been touched by her workshops, by her story, and by the tools she had given them to transform their own lives. Her success was now intertwined with theirs. She had become a part of something much bigger than herself, and that was what made the work truly meaningful. But with this success came new challenges. Deena knew that she couldn't do it all alone. She had built a strong team, but the next phase of her growth required a new kind of leadership. A leadership that was grounded in collaboration, not control. She began to trust her team more, empowering them to take on bigger roles and responsibilities. She shifted from being a one-woman show to being the leader of a movement, one that was not just about business success, but about making a real, lasting impact on the world. And in that transformation, Deena found peace. The anxiety that had once held her back, the fear that she wasn't enough, had melted away. She had done the work, had faced the challenges, and had come out on the other side stronger and more capable than ever. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone. She had proven it to herself, and that was enough. As Deena reflected on everything she had accomplished, she realized that the most important lesson she had learned was that growth wasn't just about scaling her business. It was about scaling her own heart, her own capacity to love, lead, and empower others. She had become the kind of woman who could walk into any room, speak her truth, and know that her presence mattered. And as she stood there, looking at the vision board once more, Deena knew that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid of the road ahead. She had learned to trust herself, to trust the process, and to trust the people she had surrounded herself with. She had created a life that was grounded in purpose, and that purpose was not just about business. It was about the people she was helping, the women who had become a part of her story. And for Deena, that was the greatest success of all. If this story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels.